One of the twin towers of the Inklings group, probably one of the most popular Inklings, if we judge on book sales alone, more popular than C.S. Lewis even, would be J.R.R. Tolkien. If you didn't know his real name, it's John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Tolkien lived between 1892 and 1973 and wrote two great works, along with many other works that have been published since his death, about the world of the Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien was a fantasy writer. He was also a professor of philology and English literature, and he worked at Oxford the majority of his career until he died. And during that time, he had many students and was not as popular as Lewis as a lecturer, but was more congenial, probably more approachable than Lewis. Bradley Burtzer actually tells a story about the difference between the two and their teaching styles, that Tolkien would often mumble into his hand, and that Lewis was a much broader lecturer and more of a powerful speaker. But as Lewis left the room, he would try to leave 5 minutes early so no one could follow him. So Tolkien and Lewis were quite different personalities. One was more sensitive and more reserved, and the other one was more loud and outgoing. And yet the two of them really formed the heart of the Inklings circle. They were the two initial professors in the Inklings group when it was started by the young man, Edward Lean, in 1930s, and then they continued it and made it into the form that it was kind of a novel thing to read works in progress, works before they became published and not works after they were published. And in this way, the group had a lot of influence over each other's work and how it changed. Though Lewis says, if you're going to influence Tolkien, you might as well try to influence a Bandersnatch, I think we can still see the legacy of the Inklings in the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. In addition to being a professor, Tolkien was a creator of these fantasy worlds. The Hobbit was very popular in 1937 when it was published, and his publisher asked, can we have a sequel? Of course, we don't see the sequel for 17 years later until we see The Lord of the Rings. He finishes the first draft in 1949 and then continues to work on it for the next 5 years to get it to the state that he wanted to publish it in. The composing of The Lord of the Rings, he gave a lecture after the popularity of The Hobbit on fairy stories at the University of St. Andrews. And when he gives this lecture, he explains why it is that he's creating fantasy in the way that he does. That he created Lord of the Rings not to be an allegory, but to be a world of fairy in which you get to see reality in a new way by seeing a new world. When he completed the book, the first draft, 1947, sorry, not 1949, the tale, he says, was written in my lifeblood. Such that is, thick or thin, and I can do no other. I fear it must stand or fall as it is. When he completed the other 5 books, and originally, yes, they were published as 6 books, not as one giant book, and not as a trilogy, as it's sometimes considered, but as 6 books drawn together as a chronicle of the Lord of the Rings. The first edition was dedicated then to his friends, the Inklings. And when his publishers recommended that he did not include C.S. Lewis's endorsement on the dust jacket, Tolkien came back and said, only by the support and friendship of Lewis did I ever struggle to the end of this labor. And so even though Lewis had become more known as a popular Christian writer, and Tolkien and Lewis by this point in their 50s had drawn further away from each other. Lewis was working at Cambridge and Tolkien was working in Oxford, and then of course later Lewis gets married and they are drawn even farther from each other, and yet their influence and their friendship remained strong. When Lord of the Rings came out, it was incredibly well received. There were some negative feedback that we won't actually focus on too much, but by Lewis of Lord of the Rings, he said, the book is like lightning from a clear sky. Nothing quite like it was ever done before. And W.H. Auden, when he first read The Fellowship of the Lord of the Rings, said it is intolerable to have to wait to read the rest of the story. So even though the work was not a trilogy and was actually completed all at one time, it was published as though it was a trilogy Fellowship of the Ring was published first that fall in 1954, and then in the spring and the next fall was published The Two Towers and The Return of the King. And so everyone had to wait for the next volumes to come out. The negative criticism really didn't understand what Tolkien was doing. They thought he should have stuck with the children's tales. Why are you writing a fantasy for grown-ups? And yet if we look at Phantastes by George MacDonald, and if we also look at That Hideous Strength by Lewis, those were fairy tales for grown-ups. They were written for adults. Tolkien says when he was first writing Lord of the Rings, he realized it was an adult narrative when the Black Riders came in, when you had the ring wraiths, when you had those bent, dark figures that could kill and maim and hurt and that were like evil riding on those horses. He realized he was not writing a story for children any longer, and he was writing a much different narrative. The other criticism that irked Tolkien was the criticism that the story didn't have any Christianity and had no women in it either. And Tolkien recognized that that was not actually true. The story is permeated by Christianity. Rather than walk through the Lord of the Rings literally, which probably could take 15 weeks of time, we will walk through it thematically. What are some of these great Christian themes that come up? And then how can we see that this Christianity is pervasive in the story? What is it that Tolkien is trying to do in this narrative that was different than some of his friends? There were the same influences as had influenced Williams and Barfield and Lewis and MacDonald. These influences from Christianity, right, from the faith, but also the influences, like Lewis says, of Norse mythology, George MacDonald's fairy tales, Homer, Beowulf, and of course the King Arthur stories, which come up in many of the Inklings' work. Additionally, Tolkien was the only one of the Inklings who was Roman Catholic, and so he's also drawing heavily from the stories of Mary and her humility as she sings her Magnificat, that the Lord chooses the least of these and the most humble of these in order to lead. The Roman Catholic Church also gives him the stories of the great saints like Joan of Arc and those who are in the Christian tradition or in the church. And Holly Ordway has done a fantastic job just this last year in addressing the modern sources of Tolkien's work. When Humphrey Carpenter first did his biography of Tolkien, he said that Tolkien never used modern sources, and since Tolkien was known as an Anglo-Saxon scholar, people really didn't look into this problem, and so they didn't address his modern sources. But as you can see in the story, you also have the Beatrix Potter influence. You have the hobbits looking very much like the rabbits in Beatrix Potter, smoking their tobacco and wearing their little waistcoats and being the kind of congenial mischief makers who steal vegetables from the garden. And these are very similar to Beatrix Potter's rabbits, even though Tolkien insisted over and over again that rabbits and hobbits have nothing in common and that the word in no way are supposed to be identified with one another. I think we can still see the influence that's there. If I can take a minute before we continue diving into the narrative to address Tolkien's Catholicism, because I think it's important. What we have to remember biographically about Tolkien, just like Lewis did, lost, and like MacDonald, lost his mother when he was quite young. And he had already lost his father in South Africa. His mother had been raising him and his brother, and then she passed away. But the reasons that she passed away were tragic. When her husband had died, when Tolkien's father passed away, she joined the Roman Catholic Church. And when she did, her entire family disowned her. She got sick and she could have had medicine and lived, but her family refused to pay for the medicine unless she would reject her Roman Catholicism and revert back to Anglicanism. And because she was a dedicated and devoted Roman Catholic, she refused to deny her baptism into the Catholic Church, and she died as a Roman Catholic. And the family did not adopt Tolkien and his brother, and instead a priest oversaw their affairs. They were raised in a house with other orphans. They received really good education. And if you've watched the movie Tolkien, you know a little bit about his romance with Edith and how the two of them fell in love, both of them being orphans, and came together after Tolkien's time at Oxford. But The story that was profoundly influential on Tolkien's imagination was this idea of his mother and her dedication to the church and her refusal to bow down to others' dismissal of her faith and to stand strong. And so, of course, that's how he considered his faith. His faith was a vital part of him. And even when people like Hugo Dyson, who was another Inkling, were belligerent towards his faith, he never denied it, he never suppressed it, and he always stood firm as a Roman Catholic. And it's kind of unheard of in the Inkling circle that we have at Oxford during this time these friends who were Anglican and Roman Catholic in the same circle. Even in some of the lunch areas, the Roman Catholics were not allowed to sit with the other Anglican professors. And yet here we have a group of them meeting in the evenings and going out to lunch, and that Tolkien was completely included by Lewis and the rest of this set. So I think we also have to see this friendship that overcomes what should be considered a faction between them. Maybe if we think of the elf and the dwarf friendship, that there should be a faction between Anglican and Catholicism, and yet the Inklings are showing that this faction can be dissolved and that these groups can be unified in friendship. And so we see a lot of the kind of friendship and the kind of faith that Tolkien had in his life is going to influence the kind of story that he tells. Tolkien insisted in his foreword to the second edition that people not read The Lord of the Rings as an allegory. Allegory in his mind, in Lewis's mind, and George MacDonald's mind was when you had a symbol acting as though it was walking on two legs, and that allegory really removed one from being within the story itself. Instead, Tolkien insisted on applicability. He didn't want to confuse the two. Allegory resides in the proposed domination of the author. Again, you hear that language of power that we will see Tolkien be against, versus the freedom of the reader in applicability. The freedom of the reader is protected in applicability, in which multiple ways of viewing the text are available. Not any number of ways, but multiple ways. For example, Frodo can be read as Arthur, but Aragorn can also be read as Arthur. Frodo can be read as the humble Mary, can be read as a Christ figure. Many of the different characters can be read as having attributes of this. One way of thinking about it is maybe Gerard Manley Hopkins writes the poem, Christ plays in 10,000 places, that his face appears in different ways, and it does so in The Lord of the Rings, that there is not just a Christ figure that's a one-to-one allegorical way of reading the characters, but rather that each of these characters may shine forth parts of Christ in the way that they act. And you can see the application of Christianity in the fiction, but not an allegory in the way that Pilgrim's Progress is a direct allegory. There is a character named Christian, there's a character named Hope walking around on two legs, but many of the characters in this narrative show forth hope and exhibit hope and show what hope looks like so that you can apply it to your life.